All right, we're back with another Poetry Nook. Analía, thank you for joining me again. I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you, Charlie. I'm excited and feeling cozy to start talking about poetry today.
Yes, we're getting into our cold late autumn seasons, and it's time to get cozy and talk about some poetry. I'm like surrounded by poetry books with me, in part to demonstrate some of my wayward ways of organizing poetry, which I think we're going to talk a little bit about today.
Yes, because one thing that any listener should know is that we love poetry, we love big ideas and discussing on all this stuff. But I think, at least I'm going to speak for myself, I love a good system. I am all about giving systems and structure. We were talking about this right before we got started with this recording. And so when I first read about your system for poetry on your newsletter, I was fascinated by it. And so today, one thing that I proposed was I found a poem that I was interested in the past week. And we can talk a little bit about the poem, but then I would also love for you to walk me through how you would integrate that poem into your system so that then I can take notes so that I can try it out myself. Let's do a brief intro to the system so that people know
Okay.
what this looks like, and then we will discuss the poem and come back to how
Okay.
to structure it.
Okay, so I'll sort of briefly walk folks through what I do. So this is something I posted about on my newsletter. You are here a few months ago, earlier this year, and the I guess I was going for a clickbaity title with this post because it was what Elon Musk could learn from my poetry collection. Um, and this was sort of while, there was a lot of discussion going around about like government efficiency and the bureaucracy and things like that. And as a political scientist, this is something I think about a lot, this idea of bureaucracy, right? So, like using systems and organization in order to get something done that you want to get done. So, in the government's case, it's, Congress passes a law and it's up to the executive branch to execute it, right? To actually make it happen. And they do that through the bureaucracy. And so you need systems. You can't just sort of go and do it without planning anything in advance. And so I started thinking about this in terms of what I do with my poems that I read. I read poetry every day. I have for the last, almost a decade. And the way I've been sort of this first stage of keeping track of things is through these I'll show on video, but we'll talk about it too, is these little page flags. So there's sort of little sticky notes, right, from Post-it or whatever that you could put stick on the sides or on top of pages to like mark something you want to remember. And so this is the first book of poetry I ever fully read. It's an anthology of poems. It's called Good Poems. It's by Garrison. It's selected and introduced by Garrison Keillor, who, for those who don't know, used to host Prairie Home Companion, this NPR show, for decades. But he's also really interested in poetry. He hosted his own poetry show for many years. And so this is a collection of poems by a bunch of different poets. And so it's the first one I read, and I started reading, and I was like, oh, I like this one, I like that one. And so I would take these page flags that I would use for things like, reading grad school assignments and like reading grad school readings and like, oh, here's something I should remember. And so I would do these flags and put them at the top of pages of poems I wanted to remember. So that's like the first stage of my process.
And one thing that I also want to mention, if you're not watching the video as you're listening this, is like the flags also have different colors.
Yes, they
We
do.
will we can dive into that
Yeah.
later. But that is also a detail to consider.
It's an important one, yes. Though it's not one I always sort of follow rigorously. But so this was the first one I read, and then I ended up I pulled a few that like this is how I ended up with like all these flags. These are just a few of my books of poetry. I've got Theodore Roethke here. I've got Rumi, Annie, your favorite. I've got Wendell
Mm-hmm.
Berry, Jane Hirschfield. And so, you know, I started accumulating all of these books of poetry where like I had, you know, dozens of flags, sometimes almost 100 in some of the ones that I really, really liked. And I was like, this is getting ridiculous. This is good in that I can always, if I go to one of these flags, I know I'm going to find a
Mm-hmm.
poem that I like, or at least that I liked at one point. But it doesn't, there's not a lot of information. I can't like search through them. I can't like quickly find a poem or like search by author. And so that's where the technology came in, where I looked for sort of a technological solution where I could digitally copy in all these poems, you know, go through, create an archive that I could then search by author, search by theme, search by just words that are in the poem. That could help me sort of search through and make connections for each one because I was sharing a lot of poems in my Substack and this was while I was developing this. I was like it sure would be easier if I had this sort of searchable database. And I had sort of mixed feelings about that because it you know, it sort of takes away from the aesthetic of the poetry of like poetry is not the kind of thing where you think like I need a centralized digital database of all my stuff. And I was like, is this getting too far away from sort of the point of reading poetry and being in the moment with the poem and then letting it just drift away and be its own thing? And I still haven't really answered that question. So it's a complicated sort of relationship I have with
Yeah.
that aspect of it.
I think what's interesting about it is like it definitely says something about the way our brains work that, you know, like as soon as you started describing this second stage of kind of like having the digital archive or inventory of the poetry, like it immediately makes me think of like, yeah, you needed, you know, to do some queries, kind of like a SQL system for
Yeah.
poetry.
Yeah.
And so it moves us from like that space of, you know, like the art into the science of building the structure for the art.
Well, that's it's such an interesting point since like I mean I as I was sort of putting this together, I found myself thinking in a way that I think you and I were both sort of taught to think in certain ways in grad school when we were being taught how to like write code for statistical models that we wanted to do or things like that. And I found myself thinking about it the same way that I'm thinking when I write code, where it's like, okay, it's like a logic puzzle. I need to get from this point to that point, and here's what I need to do. Here's the best way I could do this. That's not going to waste a ton of time. Um, and I found myself thinking in that same way. And I sort of came, I think, to the conclusion that like it's okay for it to be like that because I using this system, two things that it allows me to do. One, it allows me to like have the experience of going back through all of these poems I flagged because some of these, I mean, like some of these, especially this first one I showed you, like these poems I flagged probably back in like 2015 or 2016. A lot of like I was doing this before we hopped on. Like I opened up to a couple of them and I was like, I have no memory of ever reading this poem. I could not tell you what it's about. Being able to go back through them in that way as I copy them into this database is really is a fun experience for me. And then the other thing it does is sort of like let me sort of interpret which of these flags I was using and why, what it represented. And the other thing that's the other thing I add in here, which are sort of thematic tags, right? So I can search for the word winter and get all the poems that like have snow in them or you know take place during winter or encapsulate some feeling about winter or coziness or something that I can associate, or I can search for like ocean or water and and find poems that are about that. And that's the other thing that it sort of allows me to do, which is really nice, is like the revisiting of the poems is
Hmm.
definitely a big part of this, I think.
Maybe this is like a little bit of a meta analysis of this discussion around like systems for poetry, but I think that it is a nice window into how our brains kind of like adapt to a certain way of approaching things. And the reason why I'm saying this is because, so before we started recording, we were talking about, like, I have a tendency to structure and summarize every conversation that I am a part of, whether it's like podcast production, coaching session, strategic consult, whatever it is. I bring structure. And recently, I've been playing a lot with a different type of art, with digital art, just like drawing. And one thing that I found myself doing is I start like painting very free flowing. And then I find myself just like going back for structuring some of those. And so
Mm.
kind of like adding more of a very definitive line around the free flowing form. And it was interesting to find myself doing this in a pattern over time, because like then it let me learn how I consciously and unconsciously do this as part of me living. But as we're talking about this and how you have done it through the poetry, I think it's a window into how we think as researchers, even when we're not doing research, right? Because we're valuing the structure, the data, the thought process that allows for us to identify and observe the patterns.
It's such a good point, and I think it's like as researchers, and I think even generally as readers, like this is one way I've started to think about or like kind of critically examine the way I read, whether it's poetry or prose or like a really interesting newspaper article or something like that. That there are two things you're like getting out of it. And that's maybe a complicated phrase to use when we're talking about poetry that we can talk about. But like, there's, if I read a really interesting article that like sparks my interest in a research idea, or like I read something else that's really interesting that I'm like, oh, this is something I can sort of use later as the raw material for like future creativity or future writing. Um, and that's useful, and I think that's reflected in like what I've done with like my poetry. But like there's this first level too, the sort of first draft of your drawings that's like very visceral and not necessarily organized and authentic and raw, that is sort of coming out and showing it and revealing something really interesting that is not necessarily processed and thought through, and that there's a lot of value in that goes beyond just like what it is you can like mine it for or use it for. um and that's how I think about reading a lot and reading poetry a lot, that I don't want to lose in focusing too much on a system like this, which is like the incredible value of like the moment I read the poem for the first time, and that is valuable in and of itself, even if I never see the poem again, even if I never revisit it again or like draw in the more structured lines like you do with your drawings. That like this is something that has a ton of value and meaning in and of itself, that I want to make sure I don't lose by applying like the researcher's mindset automatically to all of the poems I read.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're going to like step away for a minute from the system part of it to go
Yes,
into the presence of a poem.
let's do it.
So I found one that for today that really got me thinking. And I think that I can see some of the themes we were just discussing actually. So this is a poem by David White, and it's called Everything is Waiting for You. Are you familiar with that one?
It's it's literally one of my favorite poems. I have I'm not wearing it right now, but I have a necklace that I wear that is etched on the back. It says everything is waiting for you, as like a reminder to myself.
Wow. Well,
We didn't
I
plan
want
this,
to.
folks.
We didn't plan this. Like this is so basically everything that we have been discussing in this like poetry nooks. We didn't plan for this. It's just happening
Yeah.
organically.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will go ahead and I will read it, and then we will talk about it because I'm actually very curious to hear more about why it has been so impactful for you. Ready?
Ready.
Everything is Waiting for You by David White. Your great mistake is to act the drama as if you were alone, as if life were a progressive and cunning crime with no witness to the tiny hidden transgressions. To feel abandoned is to deny the intimacy of your surroundings. Surely, even you, at times, have felt the grand array, the swelling presence, and the chorus crowding out your solo voice. You must know the way the soap dish enables you, or the window latch grants you freedom. Alertness is the hidden discipline of familiarity. The stairs are your mentor of things to come. The doors have always been there to frighten you and invite you. And the tiny speaker in the phone is your dream ladder to divinity. Put down the weight of your aloneness and ease into the conversation. The kettle is singing even as it pours you a drink. The cooking pots have left their arrogant aloofness and seen the good in you at last. All the birds and creatures of the world are unutterably themselves. Everything is waiting for you.
It's just I think it's the best. It's probably I'm not a big memorizer of poems, but it's probably the one I could get the closest to say from heart because I've read it so many times. So amazing choice. I I have lots of things I could say about this and
Mm-hmm.
what it means to me, but first I want to hear why you chose it and what you feel like it sort of speaks to in this conversation we've been having.
I was actually reflecting on this earlier today. This poem speaks to how things are happening around us, even if we're not paying attention. They're just waiting for us to notice them.
Hmm.
But that doesn't mean that it stops them. And at the same time, they're also waiting for us to become and to be present so that we notice them. So I think that there is something about, and I was actually thinking about this in the context of, like personal growth and even career development too. There are like a lot of situations in which we tend to find ourselves waiting for something else, but things are waiting for us.
Yeah, I think all of these things are waiting for us. I like that he uses a lot of inanimate objects, like objects we don't think of as having journeys or having things to do, but that I mean he uses the phone, the tiny speaker in the phone, which is I mean these days I think of my phone as like my great like the opposite of an enabler for me,
Hmm.
like something I want to throw into the ocean that is like killing me. But of course, reminding us that like the way I always read it is like the tiny speaker in the phone, which could be playing like the voice of a loved one or a song that moves you. It is a reminder that all of these things that we think of as ordinary things are all enablers of what he would call divinity or freedom or can uh they're a reminder that these things are all going on without us and that there is so much beauty and opportunity to behold if we just decide to engage with it and live with it, and that not all of it is going to be perfect, but that it the kettle that's singing as it pours you a drink, right? That these are simple things, and like a cup of tea is not necessarily going to change your life unless it's a really good cup of tea. But that this like noticing that like we have all these things like a kettle that enables us to drink the tea and that it couldn't happen without the kettle and like all these things we take for granted, I think. um I see this poem, and the reason I have it like etched as a necklace that I wear a lot of the time is that it's such a necessary reminder for me, and that in the sort of rush of modern life and all these other things that are coming at us, that this is one of the most important lessons to remember, but that is so easy to forget, I think.
Yeah. the act of presence, right? Like we talked about this in the past as well. I think that what is interesting about it, like going to your point about like the inanimate objects, and it's like even the soap, like the line about like just thinking about soap, like why is
Yeah.
um it really remind me of our conversation around you know the idea of aloneness and solitude, but also being connected with everything around us, and how we discuss that through like wild geese. And like
Hmm.
here is just like yet another reminder of that, but in a slightly different way, where to your point about spirituality, right? Like there is something about being so present that you can pay attention to the kettle while you pour the hot water, that allows for you to just be so present in that moment, to then feel connected in a way that in the everyday life, in the just like madness of it all, you can barely pay attention.
Yeah, I think that's definitely getting to a lot of what I love about this poem. So one thing, so this is a D.W. David White. This is one of his books of poetry, and I'm gonna. So first of all, this poem is in my. I pulled it up in my little database. It's in here. And I don't even have to imagine how I would
Hmm.
categorize it because I have it, but like I can't find it right now in this, but I guarantee it is one of the little page markers I use to denote not just a poem I liked, but a poem that was kind of extra special. That is one that like I want to make sure I come back to.
So I want us to kind of like place what makes this poem
Hmm.
so important to you. And,
Yeah.
like we were talking about how sometimes you go back to some of the flags for the poems that you read years ago, and you don't necessarily remember even reading them or why they were important at the time. If you were to go back to the moment where you first read this poem, can you place yourself in that moment?
I think I can. I can't say with 100% certainty, but I can say with like 90% certainty that for this poem, I was uh, sitting on a beach. I was in Delaware on the sort of southeastern sort of coast of Delaware. And I think it would have been in 2018. And it was during sort of a period of my life of like really intense change and loss and things like that. And it was sort of a yearly trip that I would take with a couple of friends to a beach house that means a lot to that my uh, grandparents owned, and that meant a lot to me, and was a place I went as a kid. It's not a sort of a part of my life anymore, but this was the period of time before my friends arrived, and so I was there by myself, and I was processing lots of different feelings, and so I sort of did the moody thing and like took a bunch of books of poetry to the beach and sat on a towel or whatever. And it was like early May. It's like right after the
Mhm.
semester would be ending,
Yes.
and so it wasn't like summer. It was still actually fairly chilly on the beach. Like I was not a person who goes in the water if it's really, really cold. So I was kind of bundled up on the beach and I was by myself on the beach. And so it was a very pensive kind of moment. It was great of you to
Mhm.
pick a poem that like I have such a visceral memory of reading
Yeah.
in such a like an interesting place. But no, I mean, I remember in particular having this exact book with me,
Mhm.
um, and you know the poem here,
Mhm.
in front of me that I'm now showing
Yeah.
you, and it has one of my like tartan sort of uh,
Sticky
really
flags.
colorful sticky flags that indicates that it was a really really important one.
So
Um,
let
so
me
yeah.
ask you this next question. So you've described the scene of you
Uh-huh.
reading this poem. What I want to challenge you to reconnect with is, what is that first feeling that the poem evoked for you?
For me, I remember at the time, like again, I said it was a time of sort of change and not necessarily good change. And it was a time when I was sort of already feeling like very consumed by feelings I was having in the moment, and that were very much all about sort of me and my personal things and one-on-one relationship. And this was, I mean, the first, I remember reading the first line of this poem. Your great mistake is to act the drama as if you were alone. And I'm sitting there alone on a beach, dealing with lots of feelings about being alone, maybe for the rest of my life. And I was like, how dare you, David White, say this to me right now? And so in a way, I took it was challenging. It was a challenge to read. It can be a challenge when you're sort of caught up in your feelings a whole lot to break out. And like the last thing my emotional state was prepared to do at the moment was like go home and look at the tea kettle and appreciate the tea kettle for how it poured me a cup of tea. But like, of course, that's a worthy and important thing to do when you're feeling really caught up, is having this reminder of like, not everything is happening right now. Like all of these things are waiting for you, and they will still be they are there now. They were there 10 minutes ago when you were totally okay, and they will be there 10 minutes from now when you start to heal and get better. And it just was such a reminder that uh it wasn't even like an anodyne kind of like, oh, everything's going to be okay, because I didn't feel that way at the moment. But it was it really had a way of shaking me kind of awake at the time. I read this poem at just the right time, at the time I needed to read it. And the other thing I will say is that at this time I was feeling a lot of difficult feelings about myself and shame and things like that. And in these last lines, right? The kettle singing as it pours you a drink. The cooking pots have left their arrogant aloofness and seen the good in you at last. Like a cooking pot seeing the good in me when I couldn't see the good in myself. And it was a nice reminder of sort of the connectedness of everything, and that, none of us, not us as people, not the cooking pots, are only what they are in one single moment. They are sort of what they are at all times.
So it's interesting because as I was reading the poem, I had this which which I feel is a little bit of a Freudian slip, but I read God instead of good in that line.
Hmm.
And I don't think that I was necessarily wrong, even though like I
Still
changed the
works.
original. But because I think it speaks to what we were talking about the spiritual side of this, right? It's like to see the good, to see the God, to see the connection with what's bigger. And I mentioned this because, to your point, what I love about this poem is that it's such a, everything is waiting for you, but also it's such a call out to move away from the self-centeredness.
Yes.
So it's like everything is waiting for you, but for you to be an active part on the bigger thing, not to stay in that space. So I can see, while you're narrating the way that you felt, I can see how that was similar to that impact that you found in that moment of being like, okay, like uh, let's move away from that pity party. Like let's
Yes.
think about bigger.
Well, because it's challenging you, and it's inviting you to recognize that you have something to contribute. It's not just calling you out, it's sort of calling you in and saying like, there's a lot of great stuff you can do, that we can do together, that you can do in interacting with other things. And so and that's what helped me, I think, a lot at that moment. So yeah, it sounds like we got a lot of the same interesting things out of it. And what I love about it is that I think it's continually applicable. It's why I wanted to like carry it around with me everywhere. And I get new things out of it. I think each time I read it, and new words jump out at me each time I read it, for sure.
So speaking about keeping it around, So I love this poem and I want to keep it around. So walk me through what you did with your system to keep it around.
Yeah. So first of all, like I said, the flag I had for it originally is one of these. It's like it's kind of like a plaid tartan design. It's not just a
Hmm.
single color, and that usually I mean to indicate like this is one really even more so than the others worth paying attention to. And it was like a pinkish red flag, which usually like could mean a lot of different things. Like I use the colors to sort of vaguely indicate certain things, like basic stuff, like if there's a poem that's about light or the sunshine, I'll use yellow, or like if water is a heavy motif, I'll use blue. This one was sort of red or pink, indicating like lots of like passion and complicated feelings and things like that. And so that's why I chose that. But then when I went to copy it in here, I used a bunch of different tags like change, unexpected, just because I found the use of the inanimate objects unexpected. Roads and journeys, that it's indicating things about that. Self, growth, creativity, that like this is to me where this calls to me most today, that it much more so than it did when I first read it, was as a call to creativity, that like I have something to say, I have something to contribute, and all these ideas and opportunities are just out there waiting for me, and it's up to me how I want to then approach it. So creativity is one I sort of approached with this one as well. So those are all the
Interesting.
tags I add, and now I can like you know click on any one of them, and then it'll pull up all the other. I have, looks like a couple of dozen poems I have also tagged with creativity, and so now I can sort of look at compare some of these and think like, oh, like how does everything is waiting for you, you know connect with some of these other poems by whatever Billy Collins or Jane Kenyon or whoever else, and that's what this system really helps me to do, is draw connections together, and that's something I really get a lot out of creatively.
Yeah. Which which now we started doing by just like creating a podcast version of it.
Yes. Yes.
So I'm curious to hear this. When you're describing it, it sounds to me that when you started like with the flag system, you were thinking about kind of like elements. So for example, whether that
Yes.
was like the deep emotions or like nature elements like water or like sun or light and
Hmm.
etc. And then when you started kind of like creating the database version of it, then you went into more of like the high level abstract concepts, whether that is like change, creativity, and stuff like that. How accurate
Yeah.
is that description?
It's perfectly accurate. And honestly, like I think of it the same way, at least as I heard from you, your process for drawing, that you have these sort of less planned, more kind of coming out of nowhere
Hmm.
sort of doodles, and then they get more finely defined, they get their outlines, they take shape, and that's how a lot of like my creative endeavors show up, and it's certainly an accurate description of the process here, where like it's elemental is a good word for how I would use the flags, which is like some poems that are yellow in here look not at all like some other poems that are yellow. It was just sort of like, this one feels right in the moment, and so I'll tag it like this and come back to it later. um it's not that the flags ended up being super useful to me down the road in terms of tagging these, because I would reread the poems as I went to actually fine tune it, put in these more specific things. And there's one element of this I want to talk about, and I have a poem to go along with it, if you don't mind.
Okay. Yeah.
It's a poem I've talked about before on my Substack. It's called Scotch Tape Body, by Ron Padgett, and it gets to something that I think is really important about this, which is the change that happens in my case between when I tag the poem, when I put in my little flag, right? In this case, the one you just read, I read for the first time Probably more than
Hmm.
7 years ago.
Yeah.
And we talked about how it means something different to me now as it did back then. And I like this poem by Ron Padgett because it's the same thing, but it's from the poet's perspective of having written the poem. So I'll just read it really quick and we can sort of talk about it maybe. So this is Scotch Tape Body by Ron Padgett. I never thought, 40 years ago, taping my poems into a notebook, that one day the tape would turn yellow, grow brittle, and fall off, and that I'd find myself on hands and knees, groaning as I picked up the pieces off the floor, one by one. Of course, no one thinks ahead like that. If I had, I would have used archival paste, or better yet, not have written these poems at all. But then I wouldn't have had the pleasure of reading them again, the pleasure of wincing and then forgiving myself, of catching glimpses of who I was and who I thought I was. The pleasure, is that the word? Of seeing that that kid really did exist. First of all, it's an adorable poem. It's a very I mean, we all have this thing of time to time of like seeing old pictures of ourselves or something we
Hmm.
wrote or but I have to say, like, I have the same feeling sometimes, especially in some of these really old ones, where in a lot of cases, yeah, the flags are like falling apart and the tape is coming off,
Hmm.
and you know, a lot of times, like the poem that you brought by David White, like that's one where I really can place myself. Most of these I really can't. I don't know where I was. I don't. Um, and so it's like it's a little window into like, hey, like some version of myself at some point really felt resonant with that poem and took the time to place that there. And isn't that interesting? Even because sometimes I go back and I read these and I'm like, why did I tag that poem? I don't, this doesn't really interest me anymore. And then I won't put it in but maybe I should still put it in my database. But I will try to like have empathy and even love for that version of myself that existed way back when. So it's a little time capsule. And I like that he sort of brought his own poet's side to this from a creative standpoint.
And so this is another kind of like serendipitous thing, but as you brought in this poem, it speaks to me in multiple ways because something that we didn't get to catch up on before recording today is like I've been navigating a lot of my immigration journey, and that has required me to go back to documents and writings and files from 13, 14 years ago. And in that process, I found a lot of my old writing when I was a freelance journalist, a creative writer, all this different stuff. And I had these moments. I had these moments like described in the poem of kind of like, well, I did this at that time and now I get to kind of like reconnect with that. And it almost like when we were talking earlier about how the previous poem evoked for you that moment in time, just like they feel like portals to who we were at different points in time. And the word that comes to my mind, and I think I resonate tremendously with in this poem, is like they are gifts, like gifts. So like we are gifting ourselves the possibility of coming back to them, of seeing what we have created. And I think there is something that we touched on throughout our discussion today that was kind of like implicit to me in in this discussion, but I want to make it very clear towards the end so that it's kind of like a takeaway, which is whether it is a poem or something that you wrote back in the day, or a drawing that you are playing with, or a system for poetry, the gift is to get started. You start with the flags, and maybe the flags later on do not make sense anymore, but then you go over and you created an updated system, and you still gifted yourself the possibility to reconnect with that version of you that met that poem at the beginning and like what that evoked for you. You might not know why you need a hard drive full of documents from like 15 years ago, but you gifted yourself the possibility of reconnecting with the version of you who was writing at that point in time. And the same with anything and everything that we create. And so I think that if there is one thing that we touched on, even if we didn't make it explicit in the discussion, I think that it's a side takeaway to our conversation today, where it's like, don't let the system or the structure or like the thinking of what the outcome will be get in the way of just the presence of just getting it done and see what comes.
I'm so glad you brought that last part up too, and this whole point, which is something I've struggled a little bit with the system is, first of all, I should say, like, I have probably, so I counted beforehand in this folder of poems. In my digital system, I have uh 553 poems in there. I have probably done about a quarter of the flags that I have made over the years. And so, like, I think about that, and it's like, it feels like this behemoth kind of thing that, like, well, when am I ever going to finish all of these? When am I ever going to completely catch up? And I have to keep reminding myself that, like, I mean, it'd be nice to catch up, but like, it doesn't, it almost doesn't matter. And it is like, whether or not some of these flags ever make it into my digital system, the reading of that poem and the flagging it originally is one small piece of what made me who I am today, and it can't be taken away, that experience, no matter what. Even if I had never, like, even if none of these flags existed and I hadn't gone into this system that is very useful to me, yeah, I wouldn't have the usefulness of the system, but I would still have read all these poems, and they still would have moved me in really interesting ways and shaped me now and shaped me for years to come, and not just in that moment. And so all of this stuff is worth doing. It is all waiting for us, as
Mhm.
David White would say. So
Indeed. And so, like, that's our invitation for each other and others who are listening. Everything is waiting for us.
it is. Thanks again for joining me for another week, Annie. See you next time.
See you next time.